pain. That is the first thing you know. A dull, throbbing ache that lives behind your eyes, and a sharper, more intimate pain that coils in your belly. You try to open your eyes, but the lids are heavy, crusted with sleep and something else. Salt? Tears. You were crying. The air is thick, heavy with the smell of stale wine, sweat, and cheap, cloying perfume. It's hot, suffocatingly so. You're lying on something rough. A straw-stuffed mattress that scratches your bare skin. Bare. You realize with a jolt that you are naked. A thin, coarse blanket is half tangled around your legs, offering no comfort, no modesty. You push yourself up, and the room swims. It's small, a cell more than a room, with no windows. The only light is a flickering, greasy orange glow from an oil lamp in a niche in the stone wall. The walls are covered in crude, explicit paintings. Men and women. Men and men. Bodies twisted in every conceivable act. Your stomach lurches. This is a lupanar, a brothel, the lowest of the low in the city of Rome. How did you get here? The last thing you remember is the market, the smell of spices and baking bread. You were with your father, selling pottery from your village. There was a commotion, a shout, a flash of steel, then darkness. You were taken, snatched from your life, from your world, and thrown into this pit. A cough from the corner of the room makes you jump. Another woman is there, huddled in the shadows. She's older, her face a mask of weary resignation. She looks at you, her eyes empty of pity. "New girl?" she rasps, her voice a dry whisper. "They'll be wanting you soon. The first one is always the worst." The door, a heavy slab of wood, groans open. A man stands silhouetted against the brighter light of the corridor. He is short, squat, with the thick neck and powerful shoulders of a laborer. He reeks of garlic and unwashed wool. He grins, revealing stained, broken teeth. This is your first client. The first of how many? You don't want to know. He lurches into the room, his eyes raking over your body with a possessive, hungry gaze. There is no kindness in his eyes, no flicker of humanity, only a brutal, animalistic desire. He throws a small, worn coin onto the floor. It lands with a dull clink. Your price. The price of a loaf of bread. The price of a human soul. He comes at you, and you shrink back. But there is nowhere to go. The wall is cold and hard against your back. His hands are rough, calloused, and they grab you with a bruising force. You struggle, you fight, but it is useless. He is too strong, too determined. He is a man who is used to taking what he wants. A man who has paid his coin and expects his due. The world dissolves into a blur of pain and humiliation. You close your eyes and pray for it to be over, for the darkness to take you again. But it doesn't. You are forced to endure every moment, every violation, every degradation. This is your new reality. This is your life now. When he is finished, he spits on the floor, hitches up his tunic, and leaves without a word. The heavy door slams shut, plunging you back into the dim, flickering light. You lie there, a broken thing on a filthy mattress, the smell of him clinging to your skin like a shroud. The coin he threw lies forgotten in the dust. The older woman from the corner shuffles over. She doesn't speak, but she hands you a damp, rough cloth. You stare at it, uncomprehending. "Clean yourself," she says, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. There will be another soon. Her name, you learn later, is Livia. She has been here for 10 years. 10 years of this. The thought is a physical blow, stealing the air from your lungs. Livia helps you sit up. Her touch is surprisingly gentle. She points to a small bowl of water in the corner, its surface filmed with grime. Don't cry, she advises, though not unkindly. It wastes the water, and the master doesn't like it. He says it spoils the goods. She looks at the bruises already forming on your arms. You fought him. Don't do that. It only makes it worse. Just go away in your head. It's the only way to survive. Go away in your head. You try to understand what she means. You try to remember your home, the feel of the sun on your face, the sound of your father's laughter. But the memories are distant, fragile things, like pressed flowers. The reality is, this room, this pain, this smell, the reality is the heavy, shuffling footsteps you hear approaching the door again. This time, the man is different. He is tall, slender, dressed in a fine linen toga with a purple stripe. A senator, or at least someone of wealth and status. He doesn't look at you, not at first. He examines the crude paintings on the wall with a detached, almost scholarly interest. He carries a small silver-tipped cane, which he taps rhythmically against his thigh. You are new, he says, his voice soft, cultured. It is more terrifying than the laborer's brutish growl. Fresh from the provinces, I imagine. What is your name? You tell him, your voice a choked whisper. He smiles, a thin, cruel curve of his lips. A pretty name. It will not last long here. They will call you something else. Something suitable. He approaches you, and you flinch, expecting the same rough handling as before, but he is different. His touch is light, almost delicate, as he traces the line of your jaw with his cane. But there is a coldness in his touch, a chilling lack of any human warmth. He is not interested in your body for pleasure, not in the same way as the laborer. He is interested in something else. Power, control, the breaking of a spirit. He spends the next hour not in a frenzy of lust, but in a slow, methodical campaign of humiliation. He makes you perform degrading acts, things you could never have imagined. He whispers obscenities in your ear, his voice a silken thread of poison. He watches you with a cold, analytical curiosity, as if you were an insect under a magnifying glass. And when he is done, he leaves as quietly as he came, leaving behind a handful of silver coins that glitter mockingly in the lamplight. This, you realize, is a different kind of violation, a deeper one. The laborer took your body. This man tried to take your soul. Days bleed into nights. The clients come and go, a blur of faces, bodies, and demands. Soldiers, merchants, slaves sent by their masters. Some are rough, some are cruel, some are simply pathetic in their desperate, fumbling need. You learn to do as Livia said. You go away in your head. You become a ghost in your own body, a silent observer of your own degradation. But there are moments, small, fleeting moments, of connection. A shared glance with another girl in the corridor, a whispered word of encouragement, a piece of stolen bread pressed into your hand. These are the things that keep you alive. These are the threads that hold the tattered remnants of your humanity together. One evening, a young soldier comes to your room. He is barely a man, his face still soft with the bloom of youth. He is drunk and he is sad. He doesn't want you for sex. He wants to talk. He tells you about his home in Gaul, about his family, about the girl he left behind. He weeps, his tears hot and wet on your shoulder. And for the first time, in what feels like an eternity, you feel a flicker of something other than fear or pain, pity, empathy. You hold him, you comfort him, you whisper soothing words in a language he doesn't understand. And in that moment, you are not a prostitute, and he is not a client. You are just two lost souls, clinging to each other in the darkness. He leaves at dawn, sober and ashamed. He presses a small, carved wooden bird into your hand. "For your kindness," he whispers, and then he is gone. You hide the bird, a small, precious secret, a reminder that even in this hell, there can be moments of grace, a reminder that you are still human. The master of the Lupanar is a man named Cassius. He is a freedman, a former slave who has clawed his way up to a position of petty power. He is a man without a soul, his heart as cold and hard as the coins he hoards. He sees you not as a human being, but as an investment, a piece of property to be used and exploited until it is broken and then discarded. Once a week, he inspects his girls. He lines you up in the courtyard, naked and shivering, and examines you like livestock. He checks your teeth, your skin, your body, looking for any sign of disease or imperfection that might diminish your value. He is a man who understands the economics of the flesh trade. He knows how much to charge for a new girl, for a young girl, for a girl with a particular skill or a particular look. He knows how to squeeze every last denarius out of your broken body. You learn that the coins the clients leave are not for you. They belong to Cassius. You are given a small, meager portion of food each day, just enough to keep you alive and working. You are given a rough, scratchy tunic to wear when you are not with a client. You are given nothing else. You are a slave in every sense of the word, your body and your life owned by another. One day, you see a girl being dragged out of the Lupanar. She is sick, her body racked with the fever that is the constant, silent terror of this place. She is no longer profitable, no longer of any use to Cassius. She is being thrown out onto the street to die. You watch her go, and you know that one day that will be you. It is the fate of all who live and work in this place. You are a commodity with a limited shelf life, and when you are used up, you will be discarded like so much trash. But you refuse to be broken. You hold on to the memory of the young soldier and his wooden bird. You hold on to the small moments of connection with the other girls. You hold on to the flicker of defiance that still burns within you. You will not let them extinguish your spirit. You will not let them turn you into an empty, soulless thing. You begin to learn the rules of this place, the unspoken codes of conduct, the subtle power dynamics. You learn to play the game. You learn to use your body, not just as a source of shame, but as a tool for survival. You learn to manipulate the clients, to play on their weaknesses, to extract small favors, a piece of fruit, a kind word, a moment of respite. You learn to listen. The men who come here, they talk, they boast, they complain, they reveal their secrets. You become a repository of information, a silent witness to the underbelly of Roman society. You learn about political intrigues, business deals, military campaigns. You learn the secrets of the powerful and the desperate. And you realize that knowledge in this world is a form of power. One day, a man comes to you. He is not a client. He is a spy. A man who works for a powerful senator who is plotting against the emperor. He has heard that you are a girl who listens, a girl who knows things. He offers you a deal, information for freedom, a chance to escape this living hell. It is a dangerous game. If you are caught, you will be tortured and killed in the most brutal way imaginable. But it is a chance, a flicker of hope in the suffocating darkness. You look at the wooden bird in your hand. You think of the young soldier, of Livia, of the girl who was thrown out to die. And you make your choice. You will not be a victim. You will be a survivor. You will use the knowledge you have gained in this place, the secrets you have learned, to buy your freedom. You will turn your prison into a weapon. You will rise from the ashes of your broken life and forge a new one. You are no longer the innocent girl from the village. You are a woman of Rome, a survivor of the Lupanar, and you will not be defeated. Antony, a man of great military prowess, of legendary appetites, and of a charisma that was both charming and dangerous, summoned Cleopatra to meet him in the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. He intended to question her loyalty and, more importantly, to secure access to Egypt's vast wealth to fund his planned military campaigns. Cleopatra, however, was not a woman to be summoned like a mere vassal. She understood the power of spectacle, the language of power, and the psychology of the man she was about to meet. She did not simply go to Tarsus. She made an entrance that would become the stuff of legend. She sailed up the river Cydnus in a magnificent and a golden and an almost unbelievable barge. The sails were purple, the oars were silver, and the air was filled with the scent of exotic perfumes. Cleopatra herself was dressed as the goddess Venus, reclining under a golden canopy, fanned by boys dressed as cupids. Her handmaidens, dressed as sea nymphs and graces, steered the vessel. The spectacle was so breathtaking, so audacious, so utterly captivating, that the people of Tarsus, and Antony himself, were left speechless. She had not come as a supplicant queen, but as a living goddess, a woman who was Antony's equal in power and in divine mystique. She invited him not to her quarters, but to a lavish banquet aboard her barge, turning the summons on its head and establishing herself as the one in control. Antony was utterly and completely and irrevocably captivated. He was captivated by her intelligence, by her wit, by her political acumen, and yes, by her charm and her beauty. But their relationship was far more than a simple romance. It was a powerful and a strategic and a deeply intertwined political and military alliance. Antony needed Cleopatra's wealth, her resources, her fleet, and her kingdom's strategic location. Cleopatra needed Antony's military might, his legions, and his authority as a Roman triumvir to protect her from her rivals, to secure her throne, and to expand her own empire. Together, they dreamed of a new and a glorious and a powerful Eastern Empire, a Hellenistic empire that would rival the power of Rome itself. For the next decade, Antony and Cleopatra lived and ruled together, mostly from Alexandria. They had 3 children together, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Their court in Alexandria was a center of culture, of learning, and of luxury, a stark contrast to the austere and the increasingly puritanical and the deeply conservative city of Rome. They were portrayed by their enemies in Rome, particularly by the masterful propagandist Octavian, as a decadent and a debauched and an un-Roman couple, a foreign queen who had bewitched a noble Roman general and turned him against his own people. Octavian painted Antony as a man who had abandoned his Roman wife, Octavia, who was, not coincidentally, Octavian's own sister, for the charms of an exotic and a dangerous and a deeply un-Roman and a deeply unsettling and a deeply unforgettable foreign queen. The political alliance between Antony and Cleopatra reached its zenith in the year 34 BCE with the donations of Alexandria. In a grand and a public and a deeply provocative ceremony, Antony declared Caesarion to be the true son and heir of Julius Caesar, a direct challenge to Octavian's own status as Caesar's adopted son. He also distributed the eastern territories of the Roman Republic among Cleopatra and their children, naming Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion King of Kings. This act was a declaration of war in all but name. It was a direct and an unambiguous and an almost suicidal challenge to Octavian's power and to the authority of the Roman Senate. The final and the cataclysmic and the world-changing confrontation between Antony and Cleopatra and the forces of Octavian was now inevitable. The fate of Egypt, the fate of Rome, and the fate of the ancient world hung in the balance. The final war between Octavian and the combined forces of Antony and Cleopatra was not just a clash of armies, but a clash of worlds, a clash of ideologies, a clash of propaganda. In Rome, Octavian skillfully portrayed the conflict not as a Roman civil war, but as a war against a foreign enemy, a war to defend Roman values and Roman honor against the corrupting influence of an Eastern queen. He had Antony's will read aloud to the Roman people, a will that confirmed his devotion to Cleopatra and his desire to be buried in Alexandria, not Rome. This was the final proof that Octavian needed. The Senate stripped Antony of his powers and declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. The decisive confrontation came in the year 31 BCE, at the naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. The battle was a massive and a complex and a deeply consequential affair involving hundreds of ships and thousands of men. Antony's fleet was larger, with bigger, more powerful warships. But Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant and his innovative and his deeply underestimated admiral, Marcus Agrippa, was more agile and more maneuverable. The battle raged for hours, a chaotic and a brutal and a bloody struggle for control of the sea. In a move that has been debated by historians for centuries, Cleopatra, with her squadron of 60 ships, suddenly broke through the lines and fled the battle, heading back to Egypt. Antony, seeing her leave, abandoned his fleet and his men and followed her. The reasons for their flight are unclear. Was it a prearranged plan? Was it an act of cowardice? Or was it a desperate gamble to save their treasury and to continue the fight from Egypt? Whatever the reason, the result was a catastrophic and an unmitigated and an almost unimaginable disaster. Antony's leaderless fleet was utterly defeated, and his army, which had been waiting on the shore, surrendered to Octavian. The Battle of Actium was the beginning of the end. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, their dreams of an Eastern empire shattered, their military power broken, their political authority in ruins. They were trapped, isolated, and awaiting the inevitable arrival of Octavian and his legions. They spent their final months in a state of despair and of defiance, of lavish parties and of quiet contemplation. They formed a suicide pact, a society of inseparable death, vowing to die together rather than be captured by Octavian. In the summer of the year 30 BCE, Octavian's forces arrived at the gates of Alexandria. Antony's remaining troops deserted him, and he received a false report that Cleopatra had already taken her own life. In a final and a tragic and a deeply Roman gesture, Antony fell on his sword. But the wound was not immediately fatal, and he was brought, dying, to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself. He died in her arms, a final and a tragic and a deeply moving and a deeply human and a deeply unforgettable end to a life of great and of terrible and of transformative and of ultimately unforgettable ambition. Cleopatra was captured by Octavian's men. Octavian intended to take her back to Rome and to parade her through the streets in his triumph, a living symbol of his victory, a humiliated queen who had been brought to heel by the power of Rome. But Cleopatra was not a woman to be humiliated. She was a queen, a pharaoh, a goddess, a woman who had lived and who had ruled and who had loved on her own terms. She would die on her own terms as well. According to the famous and the enduring and the almost mythic and the deeply unforgettable legend, she had an asp, a venomous snake, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. She allowed the snake to bite her, and she died. A final and a defiant and a deeply symbolic and a deeply unforgettable act of a queen who refused to be conquered. With the death of Cleopatra, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end. Egypt became a province of the Roman Empire, and Octavian, now the undisputed master of the Roman world, would soon become Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The age of the Republic was over. The age of the empire had begun. And the story of Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the queen who had dared to challenge the power of Rome, became a legend, a myth, a story that would be told and retold for generations to come. And so, as we come to the end of our journey through the life of Cleopatra, as we prepare to drift into the peaceful and the restorative and the deeply nourishing sleep that awaits us, let us reflect on the enduring and the complex and the often contradictory legacy of this remarkable and this unforgettable and this deeply human and this deeply unforgettable woman. Cleopatra has been remembered in many different ways over the centuries. To the Romans who conquered her, she was a dangerous and a seductive and a deeply un-Roman and a deeply unsettling and a deeply unforgettable foreign queen, a woman who had used her charms to corrupt noble Roman men and to threaten the stability of the Republic. To the Egyptians who she ruled, she was a beloved and a respected and a deeply pragmatic and a deeply successful and a deeply unforgettable pharaoh, a queen who had fought to protect their independence and to restore the glory of their ancient kingdom. To the poets and the playwrights and the artists of later ages, she was a tragic and a romantic and a deeply moving and a deeply human and a deeply unforgettable heroine, a woman who had loved and who had lost and who had died for her passions. She was a woman of extraordinary and of almost unbelievable intelligence, a woman who was fluent in multiple languages, a woman who was a student of philosophy and of science and of literature. She was a skilled and a ruthless and a deeply pragmatic and a deeply successful and a deeply unforgettable politician, a woman who navigated the treacherous and the complex and the often brutal and the often fatal world of Hellenistic and of Roman politics with a skill and a daring and a determination that few men of her age could match. She was a mother who fought to protect her children and to secure their future. She was a ruler who cared for her people and who worked to improve their lives. She was a goddess who was worshipped by her subjects and who was a symbol of the divine power and the divine mystery and the divine beauty of the ancient world. But she was also a woman who was ambitious and who was ruthless and who was not afraid to use violence and betrayal and murder to achieve her goals. She was a woman who was a product of a violent and a brutal and a deeply unforgiving age. A woman who had to be strong and to be cunning and to be ruthless in order to survive. She was a woman who made mistakes, who made miscalculations, who was ultimately defeated by a man who was even more ambitious and even more ruthless and even more cunning than she was. May the story of Cleopatra, the story of the last pharaoh of Egypt, the story of the queen who dared to challenge the power of Rome, settle gently in your mind as you drift into sleep. May you find in her story a powerful and a complex and a deeply unsettling and a deeply unforgettable reminder of the enduring and the almost mythic and the deeply human and the deeply tragic and the deeply unforgettable questions of power and of ambition and of love and of loss and of life and of death. May you be inspired to learn from her courage and her intelligence and her determination, and may you sleep deeply and peacefully, knowing that you are part of a great and an enduring and a magnificent human story. A story that stretches back into the mists of time and that will continue to unfold long after you have closed your eyes and surrendered yourself to the gentle and the restorative and the deeply nourishing embrace of sleep. Beyond her role as a political and military leader, Cleopatra was a woman of deep and of profound and of almost unquenchable intellectual curiosity. She was a patron of the arts and of the sciences, a woman who understood that the power of a ruler was not just measured in military might or in political authority, but also in the ability to create beauty and to advance human knowledge and to inspire the minds and the hearts and the souls of her people. Alexandria, the city that she ruled from, was already one of the greatest centers of learning and of culture in the ancient world. Home to the famous Library of Alexandria and the museum, institutions that had been founded by her ancestors and that had been the repositories of human knowledge and human wisdom for centuries. Cleopatra herself was a woman of extraordinary and of almost unbelievable learning. She was fluent in at least 9 languages, including Greek, Egyptian, Latin, Aramaic, and Hebrew. She was a student of mathematics and of astronomy and of philosophy and of medicine. She was a patron of mathematicians and of astronomers and of philosophers and of physicians. She supported the work of scholars and of scientists and of artists who worked to understand the mysteries of the natural world and to create works of beauty and of meaning. She was a woman who believed that knowledge and beauty and culture were not luxuries, but necessities, not distractions from the business of ruling, but essential components of what it meant to be a great and a wise and a deeply respected and a deeply beloved and a deeply unforgettable ruler. Cleopatra was also a woman who understood the power of language and of rhetoric and of public speaking. She was a skilled and a persuasive and a deeply effective orator, a woman who could move the hearts and the minds of her audiences with the power of her words. She was a woman who understood that the ability to communicate, to persuade, to inspire was just as important as the ability to command armies or to make political alliances. She was a woman who used her intelligence and her wit and her charm and her eloquence to achieve her political goals, to win the loyalty of her people, and to establish her authority and her legitimacy as a ruler. Cleopatra was also a woman who was deeply involved in the religious and the spiritual and the cultural and the ceremonial and the almost sacred and the almost divine aspects of her role as pharaoh. She understood that, to the Egyptian people, the pharaoh was not just a political leader, but a divine being, a living god, a representative of the gods on earth. She participated in religious ceremonies and rituals. She was worshipped as a goddess, as an incarnation of the goddess Isis, the great mother goddess of Egyptian religion. She understood that her role as a religious figure was just as important as her role as a political leader, and she used her religious authority to strengthen her political power and to deepen the loyalty and the devotion and the almost religious and the almost sacred and the almost eternal reverence of her people. Cleopatra was also a woman who was a skilled and a strategic and a deeply pragmatic and a deeply successful and a deeply unforgettable diplomat. She understood that the power of a small kingdom like Egypt, surrounded by the vast and the powerful and the almost irresistible and the almost overwhelming power of Rome, depended not just on military strength, but on the ability to form alliances, to negotiate treaties, to play the great powers against each other, to find ways to preserve independence and autonomy in a world that was increasingly dominated by a single and a vast and a almost irresistible and a almost overwhelming imperial power. She was a woman who understood the importance of personal relationships, of face-to-face meetings, of the ability to charm and to persuade and to inspire confidence and to establish trust. She was a woman who understood that sometimes the most powerful weapon a ruler possessed was not an army or a fleet, but the ability to make a favorable impression, to establish a personal connection, to inspire loyalty and devotion and almost religious and almost sacred and almost eternal reverence in the hearts and the minds of the most powerful men of her age. To understand Cleopatra fully, we must understand the world into which she was born, the world of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a dynasty that was marked by ambition and by intrigue and by betrayal and by murder. The Ptolemies were not native Egyptians, but Greeks, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, Ptolemy, who had seized control of Egypt after Alexander's death and had founded a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. The Ptolemies were a dynasty of great wealth and of great power and of great cultural achievement, but they were also a dynasty that was plagued by internal conflict, by sibling rivalry, by assassination, and by a slow and a steady and an almost inexorable decline. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, known as Ptolemy Auletes, or the flute player, was a man of weak and of ineffectual and of deeply compromised and a deeply problematic character. He was a man who was more interested in pleasure and in music and in the luxuries of the court than in the serious business of ruling a kingdom. He was a man who was constantly threatened by his enemies, both within Egypt and without. He was a man who was forced to rely on the power and the protection and the almost overwhelming and the almost irresistible and the almost unquenchable power of Rome to maintain his throne. He was a man who was forced to pay enormous bribes to Roman politicians and Roman generals in order to secure their support and their protection. He was a man who was deeply unpopular with his own people, a man who was seen as weak and as incompetent and as a tool of Rome. Cleopatra's mother was a woman whose identity has been lost to history, a woman whose name we do not know, a woman who played a role in Cleopatra's early life that we can only guess at. Some historians believe that she was a concubine, others that she was a member of the royal family, perhaps even a sister of Ptolemy XII, as was the custom among the Ptolemies. Whatever her identity, she died when Cleopatra was still a child, and Cleopatra was raised in the palace of Alexandria, surrounded by luxury and by learning and by the constant and the ever-present and the almost overwhelming and the almost irresistible and the almost unquenchable threat of political intrigue and of betrayal and of murder. Cleopatra had several siblings, including an older sister, Berenice, and younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. The relationships between the siblings were marked by rivalry and by suspicion and by the constant and the ever-present and the almost overwhelming and the almost irresistible and the almost unquenchable threat of violence. In the ancient world, and especially in the Ptolemaic court, siblings were not necessarily allies. They were competitors for power, for resources, for the throne itself. Cleopatra's older sister, Berenice, had actually ruled Egypt for a time before being deposed and executed by their father. Cleopatra learned from the fate of her sister that in the world of Ptolemaic politics, mercy was a luxury that a ruler could not afford, that compassion was a weakness that could be exploited by one's enemies, that the only way to survive was to be strong and to be ruthless and to be willing to do whatever was necessary to maintain power and to protect oneself and one's interests. When Ptolemy XII died in the year 51 BCE, Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, ascended to the throne as co-rulers. According to Egyptian law and according to Ptolemaic tradition, the king and the queen were often siblings, sometimes even married to each other. The co-rule of Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII was supposed to be a partnership, but it quickly became a rivalry. Ptolemy XIII was a boy of about 10 years old when he ascended to the throne, and he was under the control of a group of powerful and ambitious and deeply ruthless and deeply unscrupulous courtiers and generals who saw Cleopatra as a threat to their own power and their own interests. These men, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, worked to undermine Cleopatra's authority and to consolidate their own power. They portrayed her as a woman who was too ambitious, too intelligent, too independent, too unwilling to accept the subordinate role that they believed a woman should occupy in the male-dominated world of Ptolemaic politics. The conflict between Cleopatra and the courtiers who controlled Ptolemy XIII escalated over the years. Cleopatra was gradually pushed out of power. Her name was removed from official documents. Her image was erased from coins and from statues. She was isolated and marginalized and increasingly powerless. By the year 48 BCE, Cleopatra was forced to flee from Alexandria, and she went into exile in Syria, where she raised an army and prepared to reclaim her throne. It was at this moment of crisis, when Cleopatra's fortunes seemed to be at their lowest, when her throne seemed lost and her future seemed dark and uncertain and almost unimaginable, that Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, and everything changed. As a ruler, Cleopatra was not just a woman of beauty and of charm and of intelligence, but a woman who was deeply concerned with the practical and the material, and the economic and the political, and the administrative, and the almost sacred and the almost divine aspects of governance. She understood that a kingdom was not ruled by rhetoric, or by charm, or by the ability to inspire loyalty and devotion, but by the ability to manage resources, to collect taxes, to maintain order, to ensure that the people were fed, and that the economy was functioning, and that the infrastructure of the state was maintained and improved. Egypt, under Cleopatra, was one of the wealthiest and the most prosperous and the most productive kingdoms in the ancient world. The Nile River, with its annual floods, provided the foundation for Egyptian agriculture. And Egypt's fertile soil produced vast quantities of grain and of other agricultural products. Egypt also controlled important trade routes, and it was a center of commerce and of exchange, and of the movement of goods and of ideas and of people between the Mediterranean world and the Indian Ocean world and the African interior. Cleopatra understood the importance of maintaining and of expanding Egypt's economic power, and she worked to improve Egypt's agriculture, to expand Egypt's trade, to strengthen Egypt's economy, and to ensure that Egypt's wealth was used to support her political goals and her military ambitions. Cleopatra was also a woman who was deeply involved in the day-to-day administration of her kingdom. She issued decrees and edicts. She appointed officials and administrators. She oversaw the collection of taxes and the management of the royal treasury. She was involved in the construction of buildings and the maintenance of temples and the support of the priesthood. She was a woman who understood that the power of a ruler depended not just on the ability to inspire loyalty and devotion, but on the ability to deliver tangible benefits to the people, to improve their lives, to ensure their prosperity and their security and their well-being. Cleopatra was also a woman who was deeply concerned with the welfare of her people. She worked to ensure that Egypt's poor were fed, and that they had access to justice and to the protection of the law. She worked to improve the conditions of life for the common people, to reduce poverty and to reduce suffering, and to improve the overall quality of life in her kingdom. She was a woman who understood that the loyalty and the devotion and the almost religious and the almost sacred and the almost eternal reverence of her people depended not just on her ability to inspire them with her words and her personality, but on her ability to improve their lives and to deliver tangible benefits and to ensure their prosperity and their security and their well-being. Cleopatra was also a woman who was deeply concerned with the preservation and the restoration and the celebration of Egyptian culture and of Egyptian religion and of Egyptian history and of Egyptian identity. She understood that the Ptolemies were not native Egyptians, that they were Greeks who had ruled over Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, and that there was always a tension between the Greek culture of the Ptolemies and the ancient Egyptian culture of the land that they ruled. She worked to bridge this gap, to present herself as a true pharaoh, a true representative of the ancient Egyptian tradition, a woman who was not just a Greek ruler imposing her will on Egypt, but a woman who was genuinely Egyptian, a woman who understood and respected and honored the ancient traditions and the ancient religion and the ancient culture of the land that she ruled. She learned the Egyptian language, a remarkable and an almost unprecedented and a deeply significant act for a Ptolemaic ruler. She participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies and rituals. She was portrayed in Egyptian art and in Egyptian statuary in the traditional Egyptian style, wearing the traditional Egyptian regalia and the traditional Egyptian symbols of power and authority. She presented herself as an incarnation of the goddess Isis, one of the most important and the most beloved and the most deeply revered goddesses in Egyptian religion. She worked to restore and to renovate and to beautify Egyptian temples and to support the Egyptian priesthood. She was a woman who understood that to rule Egypt effectively, she had to be not just a Greek ruler, but a pharaoh, a divine being, a representative of the gods on earth, a woman who was deeply connected to the ancient traditions and the ancient religion and the ancient culture of the land that she ruled. Cleopatra was not just a ruler and a politician and a diplomat and a patron of the arts and sciences, but she was also a mother, a woman who bore and who raised and who cared for her children. Her first child was Caesarion, born in the year 47 BCE, the son of Julius Caesar. Caesarion was the most important and the most politically significant and the most deeply consequential of her children. He was the son of the most powerful man in Rome, and he was the heir to the throne of Egypt. He was a boy who was born into a world of power and of privilege and of almost unimaginable and almost overwhelming and almost irresistible opportunity and danger. He was a boy who was loved by his mother and who was cherished by the Egyptian people, but who was hated and who was feared and who was seen as a threat by the men who ruled Rome. Cleopatra's other children were born to Mark Antony. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were born in the year 40 BCE. Alexander Helios was named after Alexander the Great, and he was destined, in the dreams and the ambitions and the almost unquenchable and the almost irresistible and the almost overwhelming and the almost impossible and the almost tragic and the almost unforgettable hopes of his parents to rule a new and a glorious and a powerful Eastern empire. Cleopatra Selene was named after the moon goddess, and she was a princess who was destined to be married off to a foreign king in order to cement a political alliance. The youngest child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was born in the year 36 BCE. Cleopatra was a devoted and a loving and a deeply committed and a deeply concerned and a deeply protective mother. She worked to ensure that her children were educated and that they were prepared to rule and that they were protected from the dangers and the intrigues and the betrayals and the murders that were so common in the world of ancient politics. She worked to secure their futures, to ensure that they would be safe and that they would be prosperous, and that they would be able to rule and to lead and to achieve greatness. But she was also a mother who lived in a world of constant and of terrible and of almost unimaginable and almost overwhelming and almost irresistible danger. A world in which the lives of her children were constantly threatened by the political enemies of their mother and their father. A world in which the futures of her children were constantly uncertain and constantly in jeopardy. When Cleopatra died, her children were scattered. Caesarion was executed by Octavian, a final and a tragic and a deeply moving and a deeply human and a deeply unforgettable act of political murder. The twins and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken to Rome, where they were paraded through the streets in Octavian's triumph, living symbols of his victory over Cleopatra and Antony. But they were not executed. They were allowed to live, and they were eventually released, and were allowed to marry and to have children and to live relatively normal lives. Cleopatra Selene eventually married Juba II, a Numidian prince, and she became the queen of Mauritania, a kingdom in North Africa. She had children, and she had a life and she had a legacy that extended beyond the tragedy of her mother's death and the fall of the Ptolemaic dynasty. In this way, Cleopatra's legacy lived on through her children, even after her death, even after the fall of Egypt, even after the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. Her children and her grandchildren and her descendants carried forward her blood and her genes and her legacy into the future. They were reminders of a woman who had lived and who had ruled and who had loved and who had fought and who had died in the pursuit of power and of independence and of the preservation of her kingdom and the protection of her people, the advancement of her ambitions, and the realization of her dreams. The story of Cleopatra did not end with her death in the year 30 BCE. In many ways, her story only began after her death, as she was transformed and reimagined and reinterpreted by the writers and the artists and the poets and the playwrights and the historians and the filmmakers and the cultural commentators of later ages. She became a legend, a myth, a symbol, a figure of almost endless and almost obsessive and almost unquenchable fascination and interpretation and reinterpretation. In the centuries immediately following her death, Cleopatra was remembered primarily as a woman of seductive power, a woman who had used her charms and her sexuality to corrupt noble Roman men and to threaten the stability of the Roman Republic. This was the version of Cleopatra that was promoted by Octavian and by the Roman historians who wrote under the patronage of Octavian and his successors. This was a Cleopatra who was dangerous, and who was foreign, and who was un-Roman, and who was a threat to Roman values and Roman civilization. This was a Cleopatra who had to be defeated, and who had to be destroyed in order to preserve the integrity and the purity and the sacred and the divine and the eternal and the almost unshakable and the almost irresistible and the almost overwhelming power of Rome. But as the centuries passed, as the Roman Empire itself fell, and as new civilizations and new cultures and new religions emerged, the image of Cleopatra began to change. She was reimagined by the poets and the playwrights of the Renaissance as a tragic and a romantic and a deeply moving and a deeply human and a deeply unforgettable heroine, a woman who had loved and who had lost and who had died for her passions. She was portrayed in art and in literature as a woman of extraordinary and of almost unbelievable beauty, a woman whose physical charms were so overwhelming and so irresistible and so almost supernatural and so almost divine that they could bend the wills of the most powerful men of her age. She was portrayed as a woman of passion and of emotion and of sensuality and of sexuality, a woman who was driven by her desires and her loves and her lusts, rather than by reason and by calculation and by political pragmatism. In the modern era, Cleopatra has been reimagined once again as a woman of intelligence and of political acumen and of diplomatic skill and of cultural achievement. She has been portrayed as a woman who was not just a seductress, but a skilled and a ruthless and a deeply pragmatic and a deeply successful and a deeply unforgettable politician. She has been portrayed as a woman who was not just a lover, but a ruler, a queen, a pharaoh, a woman who was deeply concerned with the welfare of her people and with the preservation of her kingdom and with the advancement of her own ambitions and the realization of her own dreams. She has been portrayed as a woman who was a patron of the arts and of the sciences, a woman who was deeply educated and deeply intelligent and deeply cultured and deeply sophisticated. In recent years, Cleopatra has become a symbol of female power and of female ambition and of female intelligence and of female sexuality and of female resistance to male domination. She has become a figure of inspiration for women who are seeking to challenge the traditional and the patriarchal and the male-dominated and the deeply unequal and the deeply unjust and the deeply unfair and the deeply tragic and the deeply unforgettable structures of power and authority and control that have dominated human society for millennia. She has become a symbol of a woman who dared to challenge the most powerful men of her age, who refused to be subordinated, and who refused to be marginalized, and who refused to accept the limitations and the restrictions and the constraints that society sought to impose upon her. And yet, despite all of these reinterpretations and reimaginings and transformations, the essential and the fundamental and the deeply human and the deeply tragic and the deeply unforgettable core of Cleopatra's story remains unchanged. She was a woman who was born into a world of power and of privilege and of almost unimaginable and almost overwhelming and almost irresistible opportunity and danger. She was a woman who fought to preserve her power and to protect her kingdom and to advance her ambitions in a world that was dominated by men and by the almost irresistible and the almost overwhelming, almost unquenchable, and the almost insatiable power of Rome. She was a woman who loved, and who was loved, and who fought, and who lost, and who died in the pursuit of her dreams and her ambitions and her passions. She was a woman who lived a life of extraordinary and of almost unbelievable intensity and drama and tragedy and triumph and defeat and glory and shame and love and loss and hope and despair. She was a woman who, in the end, was defeated by a man who was even more ambitious and even more ruthless and even more cunning than she was. But she was also a woman whose legacy has endured for more than 2,000 years. A woman whose story continues to inspire and to provoke and to challenge and to fascinate the imagination of people across the world.